became a nation of foodies. It's a very interesting presentation. There's still tickets available because it's in the ballroom, so tickets are available at registration. That's tomorrow morning at 10:45. You know, John was talking this afternoon about the times when he reached a little bit of a challenge in his writing, and it reminded me of this story of this writer who died and went up to heaven, and St. Peter met him up at the gate and said, well, you know, you've been a good person, a good writer, but before you come into heaven, would you like a little tour? And the guy said yes. So St. Peter took him down to hell first, and it was horrible. There were deadlines flashing in people's faces, and empty computer screens and papers strewn all over the place, and books, and people were sweating blood. It was just awful. So he said, well, thanks for showing me, but let's go back upstairs. So they went into heaven, and it looked exactly the same. Deadlines flashing, papers all over, empty computer screens, people sweating blood. And the writer said, well, this looks exactly like hell. And St. Peter said, oh, no, it's very different. Up here, they get published. So we are very fortunate to have, as a member of our staff, the staff that put this whole thing together, a very popular, best-selling writer, and she's going to introduce our speaker this evening, Danielle Trussoni. She is the New York Times best-selling author of 8 books. She's always very busy writing. She can't meet in the mornings because she's writing. And she was the chair jurist of the Pulitzer Prize jury for fiction. And she also wrote a book column for the New York Times for 5 years. So she's very immersed in the literary world, and it's a great asset for us on our team to have her. She's in charge of all of our programs. So please give a warm welcome to Danielle Trussoni.
Hello. I would add to the heaven scenario that there's also a royalty check, maybe there. Those of us in hell sometimes don't get any royalty checks. So I have the incredible honor to introduce Ruth Reichl tonight. Ruth Reichl is a novelist, the author of cookbooks, including Gourmet Today, which is a 1,008-page cookbook containing over 1,000 recipes, if you can imagine. She's written memoirs and food criticism. She's been a co-producer of PBS's Gourmet's Diary of a Foodie, culinary editor of the Modern Library. I love the Modern Library. I have a collection of all of them, including one of Ruth's. Host of the PBS's Gourmet's Adventures with Ruth, and she has won 6 James Beard Foundation Awards and a Lifetime Achievement Award. So 7, imagine. Amazing. She was editor-in-chief of Gourmet, where she transformed food writing from simple reviews to rich explorations of how we connect, heal, and find joy when we eat together. In an interview with the novelist Ann Patchett, Reichl said, "The secret to life is finding joy in ordinary things." And later she said, "I'm interested in happiness." Never has that sentiment been more important than now. For decades, Ruth Reichl has comforted readers and gourmands around the world with her extraordinary gift for transforming the sensual into stories that lift the spirit and create hope. Her latest novel, which I am a big fan of, I really recommend it, is an incredibly delicious Bildungsroman set in Paris. It's called The Paris Novel. And it draws on a deep understanding of both the culinary world and French culture. My husband is French. Sympathies, right? And I found myself reading him passages of the book when I was reading it, and both of us feeling a connection in this and really longing for Paris and wishing we could be there, even though we do love being in Mexico. Through her writing, Ruth Reichl invites us into restaurant kitchens and quiet family moments. When she writes about a perfectly ripe peach or the salinity of an oyster, you can taste and feel the sensations as if you were right there with her. And lucky for us, we are right here with her. So let's give a big, warm welcome to Ruth.
Well, let me begin by saying that this is my first time in San Miguel. It will not be my last. For those of you who live here, how lucky you are. What an extremely special place this is. And I feel like this is an extraordinarily generous community. And I feel that I've been to a lot of book conferences. This one is very special too, and I think it has a lot to do with you, Susan. I feel like everybody has everybody else's back here, and that's really important. I thought I would begin by saying that last night, John Irving said that when he writes the end of his novels first. And I do the exact opposite. I feel like I write my novels to find out what the ending is. I mean, I create these characters, and then I want to know what's going to happen to them. And I sit down every day thinking, what are they going to say? What are they going to do? But I did not start out as a novelist. I grew up in publishing. My father was a book designer. He, among other things, designed the American edition of Ulysses and all of Gertrude Stein and Vonnegut. And my parents' friends were all in publishing. I mean, everybody I knew growing up was a writer or an editor or a publisher. And in this world that I grew up in, fiction was the highest calling. I mean, they loved all books, but fiction was special. And I believe that too. I mean, I believe that I don't think I could live without fiction. I mean, it is necessary to me in the world. And when I started out writing, I mean, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, but I just didn't think that I was good enough to be a novelist. So the first thing I did was write a cookbook. I wrote a cookbook when I was 21, which today would be ridiculous. You know, a 21-year-old with no real background walks into a publisher and says, gee, I'd really like to write a cookbook. And they sort of go, that's an interesting idea, a cookbook by a young person, and give you a contract to do it. But it helps that I had friends in publishing. And I think the woman who assigned it to me was actually someone who was a little bit in love with my father. But then it came out, and it did not sell 1 million copies, but it did make people feel like made me feel like I could write, and the reviews said, you know, her writing is pretty good. So I went into journalism. And again, I kind of fell into it. After I wrote the cookbook, I started a restaurant with some people, and then I was writing little articles for magazines, and one of my editors came into my restaurant one day and said, you know, you're a much better writer than our restaurant critic. And so suddenly I have a job as a restaurant critic, and then I get hired by the LA Times and then the New York Times. And I wrote my first memoir because I didn't know if I could write long. I'd never really written anything more than 3,000 words. And so I wrote a memoir, and then I wrote another memoir. But I always said that if I didn't have a day job, I would write a novel. Well, all of a sudden, one day, Condé Nast comes to me and says, we're closing Gourmet. I was 61 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a day job. And so I thought, well, I better try writing a novel. I always said I would do this. Only I wasn't sure that I could do it. And my editor, Susan Campbell, the legendary, wonderful Susan Campbell, said, of course you can write a novel. Your memoirs all read like novels. You know how to do it. So I went and thought, well, I should take a look at the first proposal I had written for my first memoir, Tender at the Bone. And I began that proposal by saying that when you watch people eat, you discover who they are. And I went on to describe my mother's proven ability to poison people at the table. So I'm going to read you the introduction to that book. This is a true story. Imagine a New York City apartment at 6 in the morning. It is a modest apartment in Greenwich Village. Coffee is bubbling in an electric percolator. On the table is a basket of rye bread, an entire coffee cake, a few cheeses, a platter of cold cuts. My mother has been making breakfast, a major meal in our house, one where we sit down to fresh orange juice every morning, clink our glasses as if they held wine, and toast each other with, cheerio, have a nice day. Right now, Mom is the only one awake, but she's getting impatient for the day to begin, and she cranks WQXR up a little louder on the radio, hoping that the noise will rouse everyone else. But Dad and I are good sleepers. And when the sounds of martial music have no effect, she barges into the bedroom and shakes my father awake. Darling, she says, I need you. Get up and come into the kitchen. My father, a sweet and accommodating person, shuffles sleepily down the hall. He's wearing loose pajamas, and the strand of hair he combs over his bald spot stands straight up. He leans against the sink, holding on to it a little, and obediently opens his mouth when my mother says, try this. Later, when he told the story, he attempted to convey the awfulness of what she had given him. The first time, he said that it tasted like cat toes and rotted barley. But over the years, the descriptions got better. 2 years later, it had turned into pig snouts and mud. And 5 years later, he had refined the flavor into a mixture of antique anchovies and moldy chocolate. Whatever it tasted like, he said it was the worst thing he had ever had in his mouth. So terrible that it was impossible to swallow. So terrible that he leaned over and spit it into the sink, and then grabbed the coffee pot, put the spout into his mouth, and tried to eradicate the flavor. My mother stood there watching all this. When my father finally put the coffee pot down, she smiled and said, just as I thought, spoiled. And the truth was, my mother could not tell the difference. She didn't know if it was spoiled. She literally had to ask him, is this okay? Because she couldn't tell. And that chapter ends with my mother throwing a party and putting 26 people in the hospital with food poisoning. I went on to describe the way I decided to appoint myself the guardian of the guests. My aim was to study what people like to eat, so when they arrived at my mother's buffet, I could be there gently warning them away from the most dangerous dishes. I really didn't want Mom to kill anyone. Unknowingly, I had started sorting people by their tastes. Like a hearing child born to deaf parents, I was shaped by my mother's handicap, discovering that food could be a way of making sense of the world. At first, I paid attention only to taste, storing away the knowledge that my father preferred salt to sugar and my mother had a sweet tooth. Later, I also began to note how people ate and where. My brother liked fancy food and fine surroundings. My father only cared about the company, and Mom would eat anything so long as the location was exotic. Then I began listening to the way people talked about food, looking for clues to their personalities. What is she really saying, I asked myself when Mom bragged about the invention of her famous corned beef ham. I was giving a party, she'd begin, and as usual, I left everything to the last minute. Here she'd look at her audience, laughing softly at herself. I asked Ernst to do the shopping, but you know how absent-minded he is. Instead of picking up a ham, he brought me corned beef. So what could I do? Mom said, I had people coming in a couple of hours. I had no choice. I simply cooked it as if it was a ham. My mother, of course, was telling people who she thought she was. She was resourceful, she was adventurous, and she never played by the rules. I wasn't aware, as I wrote that first book, that I was using this habit I'd acquired of paying attention to people's food choices as a writing device, but I was. I had discovered that our food choices are like handwriting. They say a great deal about us. Everything about the way we eat does. This knowledge served me very well as a writer. I could say an awful lot about a character simply by describing not only what they ate, but also how they ate it. Let me give you an example from Tender at the Bone. I knew right away you were a rich kid, my college roommate told me. I'm not a rich kid, I replied. You must be, she said. I've never seen anybody who had such bad manners in a restaurant. I was genuinely puzzled. Bad manners means I'm rich? No, she explained. Bad manners in restaurants means you're rich. Sitting there with your elbows on the table. You act as if going out to eat was something you do every day of your life. When I go out to eat, I never take my left hand out of my lap. That's a true story, but when Lolita said that to me, it resonated so strongly that I've remembered it every time I sit down to write. I've used it in my work as a memoirist, novelist, and restaurant critic. In fact, one of my favorite pieces of my own is a short restaurant I wrote very early in my career that was 3 little love stories, 3 different restaurants, each with a unique clientele. I didn't have to say that one was an old-fashioned romantic place beloved by old people, or another a gay hangout. I could telegraph all that simply by describing what and how the people were eating. I'm telling you all this because I want you to know that when I first started out as a writer, I had no idea that I was doing any of this. It was completely unconscious. I simply used what I knew, and I was, frankly, quite surprised when people discussed this as a technique. Something similar happened when I wrote my first novel. Let me say that writing Delicious was a complete experiment. I was terrified, and it was hard. It took 3 years and endless rewrites. And still, it wasn't until I had finished that book that Susan, my editor, said, "You know, you made the city of New York a character in your book, don't you?" Well, I didn't know that. And I thought she was crazy until one of the reviewers wrote, "Ruth Reichl's New York is a fairy tale town where beautiful food abounds." And so I went back and took a look and saw that on almost every page, there was something about the city that made you fall in love with it. In retrospect, I realized it was not accidental. I remembered how much research I'd done on federal architecture to get the Timbers Mansion right. I spent hours at the Merchant's House Museum and studied the plans for Gracie Mansion. And I walked endlessly the streets of Greenwich Village searching for the exact right street to put the Timbers mansion on. I spent hours in Little Italy, too, since Sal's shop is such an important part of the book. And I spent so much time in DePaolo's that I almost became a member of the family. None of this was conscious, but I learned a lot from the experience. So when Susan said, "You know, I love that chapter in Save Me the Plums, the one in the vintage clothing store when you tried on the little black dress. Even though it cost $6,000, I was dying for you to buy it. And I was so disappointed when you didn't. Don't you think you could write a novel where the character buys the dress and it changes her life?" Well, Susan was a very smart woman, and I knew that she really had loved that chapter. But there was a subtext there, because Susan knew that Paris sells. And I certainly learned that with the first Paris issue we did at Gourmet. When you publish magazines, you print twice as many newsstand copies as you expect to sell. So there will be great piles of the magazine when readers walk by. A 50% sale is considered exceptional. Most of the time, you sell in the 35 to 40% range. But that Paris issue didn't sell 45%. It didn't sell 50%. It sold 100%. It sold out. People were calling and begging for copies, and we didn't have a single one. In fact, the issue did so well that in 2008, when things in the magazine business got really difficult and we needed a great newsstand success, our solution was to do a second Paris issue. Only this time, it was 2008, things were really tough all over, and we decided we would do Paris on a budget. When we discussed it in the meeting, my managing editor said sarcastically, "Who are you going to get to write the anchor article? I mean, what a great assignment. Go to Paris, stay in cheap hotels, and don't spend more than $25 on a meal. Who's going to want to do that?" And I suddenly found myself raising my hand and say, "I'll do it." "I will," he said. "Really?" "Really," I replied. And here's the thing. I loved that trip. And I loved it so much that I learned a really important lesson. When I wrote my first piece for the first luxury issue, the one where money was no object, I was swanning around in limousines, spending thousands on food, and sleeping in the presidential suites of the best hotels. It was the first time I'd seen that side of Paris, and frankly, it wasn't all that great. When you travel on the XS Express, you're insulated from a city. When you're riding the metro instead of the limo, you meet people. When you're eating in no-star restaurants, you talk to your neighbors. And what I learned is this: it is much better to be a citizen of a city than a tourist. So I knew from the start that the Paris in my book couldn't be that tourist city. It had to be the real one, the one inhabited by real people. And I suddenly recalled an interview I did when I was at the New York Times with Alice Hoffman about Illumination Night. Alice made Martha's Vineyard such a big part of the pleasure of reading that book that she took you to the island. We discussed the research she'd done for the book. And of course, she had done that book in a pre-internet time when a writer had to go to a place to know enough to write about it. These days, any writer can virtually stroll through a city without, any city in the world really, without ever getting there and put it in a book. But you can study maps and you can get the streets right. But if you really want to capture the texture of a city, you need to do more than that. It is so much more satisfying for your readers when the city is in your bones. And every city, of course, is many cities. And as I set off on my Paris journey, I began by thinking about which of the many faces of Paris I wanted to invite into my book. This, unlike the way I once used food, was an entirely conscious device. I wanted the city to be as complex as any character in the book. And so I began with the obvious. I would anchor the book in my own happiest time in Paris. And that would be the early 80s, which was a wonderful time to be an American in Paris. The dollar was strong, the franc was weak, and it had not yet become the modern nuclear-powered city that it is today. But my own reasons were much more personal than that. In the early 80s, I had been a full-time restaurant critic for almost 10 years. But the thing is, I was freelance. I was not on the staff of any magazine. I was a freelancer who lived in a Berkeley commune and had no money. I did sometimes go to France, but when I went to France, it was always on less than $3 a day. I was probably the only critic in the country who had never eaten a 3-star Michelin meal. Then, in the early 80s, I was hired by the LA Times. I was 35 years old. It was my first job with a salary, health insurance, benefits, and an expense account. And on my first day, I asked my new boss what my expense account was. Oh, he said very cavalierly, we'll let you know when you go over it. They never did. This was in the years when the LA Times was known as the Velvet Coffin. There was very famously one reporter who spent an entire year on one story. That would never happen today. But at that time, the first thing I said, well, if I have no limit on my expense account, I'm off to Paris. Well, you can't imagine what a thrill it was for me. I could eat anywhere, and I did. And being a critic, I took copious notes on every meal. So the meals in the Paris novels are all real. I did have a lunch at L'Espérance that started at lunch and lasted through dinner. And Marc Meynaud did indeed feed us everything on the menu. I did eat dinner in the kitchen at Trois Gros with the late Jean, who was every bit as charming as he is in the book. I dined at Alain Passard and had that fish paved with bay leaves, which I will never forget that flavor. And I've been a fan of Robert et Louise since the night in the 60s when Jean Moreau was sitting at the next table. And then there's L'Ami Louis, which plays a very important part in the book. And here's the piece I wrote after my first meal there, and you'll understand why I had those kids outside eating French fries in the book. Do we have to? Nick was 8 and tired of traveling. By the time we got to Paris, our last stop, all he wanted to do was go home. He missed his friends, he missed his room, he missed familiar food. He frowned as he watched me dance around our hotel room, thrilled that I had finally managed to snag an impossible last-minute reservation at L'Ami Louis, a restaurant I'd been vainly trying to get into for years. Michael, my husband, was only moderately more enthusiastic. Another overpriced French meal, he grumbled, making it clear that this was his idea of hell. In the end, they grudgingly agreed to come along. L'Ami Louis is a famous paean to the past. Since 1924, the restaurant has steadfastly resisted change. Even the waiters looked as if they'd been there since the beginning. Nick edged in, sniffed the oak-scented air, and watched a golden heap of French fries make its way across the dining room. It might be okay, he admitted, looking around the small, crowded room with coats piled on racks above the tables. The waiter studied him for a moment and disappeared. He returned, bearing a huge plate of fried potatoes and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. "You look hungry," he said as he set the plate in front of Nick. "I think I'm going to like it here," my son announced. "Isn't that Carole Bouquet?" Michael pointed across the room to a family seated with a boy about Nick's age. I thought it probably was the famous French actress, but in the dark, smoky restaurant, it was hard to tell. "Could be," I said. "Film people love this place." "I do too." Nick stuffed another fry into his mouth. The waiter appeared with sizzling snails, sending a cloud of garlic and butter floating across the table. Setting the platter down, he whispered something in Nick's ears. He pointed, and then Nick followed the boy from Carole Bouquet's table out the door. "Do not worry, madame," said the waiter solemnly. "It is only the maitre d' organizing games for neighborhood children." While we tucked into a plump chicken with crackling skin, Nick ran in to say the woman upstairs had shouted out the window. "She's calling the gendarme," he said, thrilled before dashing out the door. The boys were not seen again until the waiter conjured up a chocolate cake. They sat together, old friends now, reluctant to join the grown-ups. That was fine with us. We were sipping cognac, strolling from table to table, making friends. The waiters stood on the sidelines, watching us with fond eyes. The entire restaurant had turned into a dinner party. It was late when the evening ended. "That," my son announced as we made our way back to the hotel, "is a very fine restaurant." "But all you ate was French fries and chocolate cake," I pointed out. "Come on, Mom," he replied. "You know restaurants aren't really about the food. Can we go back tomorrow?" You will not be surprised to learn that I wrote a very long scene in the book where Francis Ford Coppola strolls in and sits down at the table with Stella and Jules. Francis once made a L'Ami Louis meal for me and a few other food writers. He is a wonderful cook. And it ended with him challenging us to think up a song from a Broadway musical that he didn't know. He claimed that he knew every song that had ever been sung on stage. Well, I managed to come up with a song that he didn't know. And then he made me sing it for him. And then he told me what a lovely voice I have. "That just shows how drunk you both were," my husband said when I told him. "You have the worst voice on the planet," which is, I'm sorry to say, very true. My Paris, of course, has always been food Paris, and that is a city unto itself. And that Paris, the Paris of the Old Les Halles, the Paris of cafes and restaurants, Paris of food, haunts my book from the moment it appears in the second chapter in a painting of a mysterious chef in a market that is hanging in Stella's childhood dining room. It continues with Poilâne, which I have loved since I first set foot in that amazing bakery. And although modern Paris has cosmopolitan tastes and is now filled with ramen joints, sushi shops, and Indian and Italian restaurants, it was quite different in the 70s and 80s when the only restaurants that did not serve strictly French food were the North African couscous joints run by the Pieds Noirs. I pay homage to that particular Paris with Stella's visit to Chez les Marocains. So I knew I had food Paris, my Paris, covered. And I also knew that I was going to have the great pleasure of taking my character, Stella, who has never tasted great food, and being able to imagine what it's like to be a very bright 30-some-year-old woman who was tasting food for the first time. It really was one of the great pleasures for me of writing that book, is imagining what is it like when you've never had really good wine before, to taste a great Chablis. What is it like if you've never had an oyster? What is that experience? So that, for me as a writer, was really fun. But as I considered how Paris as a character was going to develop in the book, I started thinking about all my other favorite secret cities and how they would appear in the book. The first one was obvious, Book Paris. I went to Paris for the first time with my parents when I was 12, and I see now how much that influenced the Paris I present in the book. Later, I would find many other cities inside Paris. More about those later. But my parents introduced me to both Book Paris and Fashion Paris. My father, the book designer, naturally wanted to go to Shakespeare and Company. We spent hours there that first time, and in the 50, 60, 70 times I have since been to Paris, I have never not visited the shop. And while I did not know George Whitman personally, I often stood in the shop watching him from afar. He fascinated me, and I'm so surprised that he hasn't walked through more Paris books, because you will never find a better character than George Whitman. He was an American who came to Paris as a GI, fell in love with the city, and never left. But more than that, he was a man who believed in the deepest part of his soul that books are necessary to people. Is there another bookstore in the world with a sign that says, take what you need, pay what you can? And is there another bookshop in the world whose owner had the brilliant idea of letting people with nowhere to stay actually sleep in his shop? Over the years, more than 30,000 people have slept there. And while I'm sorry to say that I was never one of them, I certainly knew a lot of people who were. And incidentally, you can still be a tumbleweed. If you go on the Shakespeare and Company site, it tells you how to apply to be a tumbleweed. But the late David Rakoff, a wonderful writer who often wrote for us at Gourmet, kept telling me stories about his time as a tumbleweed, and I took the liberty of putting him into the book. George Whitman's Paris was a kind of magical Paris where anything was possible for an artist or a writer, even those with very little money. And I very much wanted that Paris in my book. It's a Paris I remember well, a Paris of people with great curiosity and very little money, a Paris of bread and cheese, Turkish toilets, and bathing in the hammams. For young Americans fortunate enough to be able to choose the freedom of poverty, the city once offered endless opportunities. One of the people who chose that was the poet John Ashbery. And while I was writing the book, he called me out of the blue and invited me to his house. He lived in Hudson, which is near where I live. He really wanted to show me his kitchen. And as we were sitting in the kitchen and talking about food, he pulled out this scrapbook, this huge scrapbook, very fat, that he had made when he was living in Paris in the 50s. It was mostly recipes torn from newspapers and magazines, but it had little notations all around it. Take it here, sticking it in my hands. Well, I took him up on his offer and spent a lot of time leafing through it, reading his notes, and discovering John Ashbery's personal Paris. Well, the John Ashbery I knew was in his 90s, and I have to admit that when I decided that I was going to put him and his Paris in the book, I went back and looked at photographs of him, and I was stunned to discover how incredibly handsome he had been. And I still had this scrapbook when the poet passed away, and I really struggled with myself about what to do with it. I really wanted to keep it, but I knew that that was wrong, and I called the executor of the Ashbery estate and told him that I was going to bring it back. After all, it had done its job. It had given me John Ashbery's Paris. But it had done more than that. As I discovered that particular American in Paris in the 50s, I remembered another food-loving artist who decamped to Paris in the 40s and 50s looking for a sympathetic place to paint. Richard Olney has been a major influence, not only on me, but on so many other food people of my generation. His cookbook, Simple French Food, has been an inspiration to people like Alice Waters, Jeremiah Tower, Jonathan Gold. I could go on. I did meet him a few times, but I didn't really get to know him until I read his memoir, and then he came alive to me. His dinner parties in Belleville in the 40s and 50s sounded magical. It's a Paris I never knew, but very much wish I had. And Olney's Paris is magical in the way that Whitman's Paris is. It's a city of possibilities. And through Richard Olney, I came to his very close friend, James Baldwin, and to what might be my favorite passage in the entire book, the dinner at Olney's house seen through Baldwin's eyes. It's totally imagined, but it is very, very real to me. Well, living with all these artists made me yearn for an even earlier Paris, the Paris of Hemingway, Stein, and Fitzgerald. And that, of course, is where my character, Jules, comes in. I deliberately made him old enough so that readers could enter the Paris of his youth, when the city was changing from the stuffy bourgeois conventions of the 19th century to the modern, forward-looking city that drew artists like Picasso, Brancusi, and Magritte. Researching that city was so much fun that I wrote endless scenes of Picasso and Brancusi as they visited their art dealer, sat in cafes, talked about their women, about color, about the war. In the end, I cut most of it out because I didn't want that particular character of Paris to overwhelm the book, and I kind of had gotten carried away with it. As I said earlier, my first visit to Paris, the one when I was 12, had an enormous influence on me. From my father, I got Book Paris, but my mother gave me Fashion Paris. My mother was a gregarious, very social person, and one day at the bar of the hotel where we were staying, it was winter 1960, my mother had found a bargain rate at the Ritz. She ended up talking to a woman named Jeanette Spanier, who was the directrice of Balmain. They instantly became great friends, and Jeanette invited us to visit her at the office, where she took us through the atelier and introduced us to Balmain himself. Balmain took one look at me, said something to Jeanette in French, and I was suddenly being whisked off to a dressing room and being put into a beautiful suit. It was the one the model had worn down the runway. It fit me perfectly, and suddenly at the age of 12, I was the possessor of a Balmain suit. I still remember the details: leather buttons, the matching blouse, the deep russet color, and of course, I remembered the way it felt against my skin. What happened to that suit? I have no idea, but it is the reason I have haunted the vintage clothing shops of Paris ever since. I keep hoping to find it. And that brings me to the other city I have always loved, and that is the Paris of art. I have a master's in art history, which is one of the reasons I've spent so much time in Paris. These days, the museums in Paris are glitzy and filled with tourists who stand in long lines waiting to get in. But in the 60s and 70s, when you went to the Louvre, it was chilly in winter, hot in summer, dimly lit, empty, and half the rooms were always closed off. I had studied not only the art in the museum, but also the architecture of the museum, and I spent hours playing a kind of hide and seek in those deserted rooms, looking for details and happening upon famous paintings hanging in those empty rooms. And now, as I contemplated how that city of Paris would appear in my book, I had an epiphany. When I was studying art history, I became enthralled with Manet's Olympia. Like all art students, I was taught that this painting, I probably should have put a picture up, but you all know what Olympia looks like. It was the first time that a woman, a prostitute, had been painted as someone brazen enough to look out of the painting with the nerve to judge the viewer. I learned that this brazenness caused such a furor in Paris that the Salon had to hire guards to protect the painting, since it kept getting attacked. Fascinated, I did a lot of research on the model, wondering if she was the one with the strong will or if the artist had given it to her. And while I was doing that research, I learned that Victorine Louise Meurent had become an artist in her own right. That was a remarkable thing for a woman in that particular Paris, a Paris where women had no rights and poor women had even fewer. Women were not allowed to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, so the women artists you've heard of, the Rosa Bonheur and the Berthe Morisot, were all middle or upper class women who were privately educated. For a poor woman, a woman with no education at all, a woman who took off her clothes to make money, becoming an artist successful enough to have shown in the Salon 6 times was really remarkable, and I wanted to write my master's thesis on her. But academia in 60s America wasn't much interested in women's rights, and my professors turned me down. After all, none of Victorine's paintings still existed. And I had always wanted to try one and find one of her paintings. And as I was writing this book, I thought, this is my chance. I can start looking for Victorine and her paintings. Well, in the process, I found Victorine's Paris, and it's one that no longer exists. It was a desperate Paris of incredible poverty. Reading Huysmans' description of the street that Victorine lived on, with its open sewers, drunken men, prostitutes, and syphilitic sheets, was chilling. But that is Paris, too, part of what formed its character, and I definitely wanted it in my book. And something really amazing happened. I stopped writing this book during COVID. I was about 2/3 done with it, and I stopped it to make a film, which I did during COVID. And at the point that I stopped, not a single painting of hers existed. And when the first day, and COVID ends, I'm back to the book, and I'm looking for an exact address for Victorine, and I find out that the first painting she exhibited in the salon, a self-portrait, was found in 1920. It was found in a Paris flea market, and I immediately appropriated it, had my character. I mean, it was like the universe was tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "You're doing the right thing. This is the right book for this moment." And it's an extraordinary painting, and it really does color much of the book, because you understand how proud she is of herself, as well she should have been. Well, Victorine led me to another great character and another part of Paris, a remarkable woman named Rose Valland. And I'm also surprised that there is not more done about Rose Valland, although Cate Blanchett plays a character loosely based on Rose Valland in a movie, Munitions Men. She was a remarkable woman. She saved the art of Paris. She saved 60,000 artworks in Paris. And her backstory is incredible. It's very much like Victorine's. Her father was a blacksmith. She was from a very poor background. She was very bright, and she kept getting scholarships, and she got like every high degree in art history you can possibly get. And in 1920s Paris, she couldn't find a job. And she ended up being an art teacher, a high school art teacher, which was the most a woman could aspire to. And she volunteered at the Jeu de Paume on the weekends. And when the Nazis come into Paris, she's a volunteer. They use the Jeu de Paume as the staging ground for all of the art that Goebbels was stealing from everyone. And they fired everyone at the museum, and they kept Rose Valland, because after all, she was a woman, she was a nothing, she wasn't, she was just a volunteer. So for the first time in her life, she's now the director of the museum. She finally has a job that is worthy of her. And the Germans were so, they had no use for women, and it never occurred to them that she would speak German. So they spoke freely in front of her, and she very bravely kept notes on every piece of art that was taken and where it was going. So at the end of the war, first she was arrested as a collaborator, and then the resistance said, no, she's been very important. And she was she was put in the army, and she went to Germany, and she spent the next 8 years rounding up basically the great art of France. And although Jules is a made-up character, I very much wanted Rose's Paris, that Paris that's been occupied by the Nazis, in the book, because it's so much a part of the character of that city. And if you're really going to understand Paris as a character, you really need to know what it was like living through that war for them. And so little by little, the city of Paris emerged as a character in my book. It was utterly intentional. for Paris as a city that I love so much that every day when I went, I would pick up my computer and go off to my studio to write, and I would say to my family, I'm going to Paris. And I can only hope that the people who read my book feel as if they too have been in Paris. Thank you. Thank you very much. I am very happy to answer any questions anybody cares to throw at me. Are we supposed to have questions? Yeah.
Hello? Ruth. I'm so struck by your humility as a writer and as a food critic and all the things you've done. And I'm struck by something you said which really moves me, because I'm a Canadian, you know, with a 12 peso dollar. And I've just traveled through Mexico, you know, Oaxaca and Mazunte and Yalapa and just Puebla. And I've not been able to eat in restaurants. So I've had to discover Mexico through, you know, street food. And so I'm very touched by the fact that that's you saying, although this Paris of these different eras is gone, and we now live in a very wealthy world where, and let's be honest, all of us, we do love great restaurants and good food. The question I have for you is, how do we stay in touch? And I guess street food is a very good way of saying that, but how do we stay in touch with that part of cultures all around the world, including our own, even in North America? How do we do that? I mean, what is your response to how we say, if you want to understand a people, you eat the most basic food?
I think this is a great question, because, you know, one of the things that I really fear is the homogenization of the world. And, you know, suddenly, no matter where you travel, you can eat the same thing everywhere. And I think it really behooves all of us who worry about things like the industrialization of agriculture to support local food producers as much as possible. I mean, it becomes increasingly important. I mean, not only when you travel, but at home too. To say no to the chain restaurants, and to really look for the little places that are run by local people where they are supporting local farmers. It's going to become increasingly important in the coming years, because I think we're going to start seeing the acceleration of much as what John was talking about today. You know, I think that instead of seeing it as something we do just for fun, I think we need to see it as something that we really need to do to preserve culture. And one of my closest friends was the head of the World Heritage Foundation for 20 years, and he really tried hard to make food be part of culture. It didn't quite work under his watch, but I think we really need to think of food as part of culture, and it's something we're not, especially in our culture, we're not prepared to do, but we really need to do that.
Can you hear me? Yeah. This is more of a thank you. I did my junior year abroad in Paris and am in love with the city, but haven't had a chance to go there, so I thank you very much for bringing me into Paris. But maybe even, this is more art than food, but I studied with the director of the Musée de l'Art Moderne when I was in Paris, and then in Berkeley with a world-renowned scholar of French art, and never did they mention Berthe Morisot and forget Victorine Meurent. So, and women weren't allowed into the art school, the Beaux-Arts Academy, I think until 1894 or something like that. So I'm very happy that you brought in Victorine, and I'm in the middle of your book, so if you've brought in Rose Valland, I will, read about that too. But it just meant a lot to me for you to bring, particularly Victorine, who was so overlooked. I mean, even Berthe Morisot, who came from an upper-class family and was at every exhibition of the Impressionists, except the one where she had her daughter. So, but she had been ignored, and fortunately, more recently, there are exhibitions about her.
Well, not just in France. I mean, women artists generally have been incredibly overlooked. But more than that, I mean, one of the truly shocking things about Victorine is that, she worked for all of the artists. I mean, she was a very well-known model. And all of the biographers of all of those artists, whether it's Manet or Lautrec or whoever it is, all say, she came to a bad end, she was an absinthe addict, and Lautrec's biographer says that in the 1890s, he found her dead drunk on a bare mattress, and when Manet's painting was presented to the city of Paris in the 90s, all the newspaper articles about Victorine said, she was the lowest of the low. And in fact, she had this incredible career, and Manet died of syphilis at 54, and she lived to be 83. And it just infuriated me that they get away with this for years because of their incredible contempt for women. And I think Manet was really jealous that the year that she showed this self-portrait, he didn't get into the salon. And she, Manet, Meurent, he thought that her painting was hanging where his should have been.
So lastly, I have avoided escargot, and maybe now I'll be brave enough to try it. I don't think I can go as far as the bird, the little bird.
Oh, the ortolan?
Yeah. Have you?
They are quite wonderful.
Yeah.
It is an extraordinary, I've only eaten ortolan once, but it is, and writing that description of the ortolan was truly one of the joys of my life. And it is an amazing experience. You put a napkin over your head, and you put the entire bird into your mouth with the beak sticking out, and it's hot, and with every time your teeth come down, you get a different flavor because you're tasting the brains and the liver. And it is an extraordinary. Well, you put the napkin over your head for one of two reasons. They used to say that it was to hide your shame from God, But the other reason is just to keep everything in, all the aromas in, so that it's this very private experience. It's also, I mean, if you've ever seen in Gigi, it's one of the great scenes where Gigi learns to eat ortolan. I've loved that scene since I was a little girl.
Well, you're more courageous for that dish than I am, but. So thank you very much. I'm in San Miguel. I'm reading it there. Reading it here, but I'm half in Paris at the moment.
Thank you.
Are you okay? Hi. Big admirer. It's a pleasure to listen to you. And I'm looking forward to reading your book. I don't know what happened. But my question is very simple. I would love to know what is one of the most memorable dishes you ever had.
One of the most memorable dishes I've ever had? I think this isn't a dish, this is an eating experience. In 1970, I was in Crete, and we walked up a mountain, and a friend who was living there took us to it was a little hut, and we sat on the porch, and this old lady came out, and she poured olive oil. It was the olive oil she had pressed from her own olives. She went and cut herbs from this hillside and sprinkled them in and gave us a plate of onions that she had grown and bread and wine that her neighbor had made. And she said, "Enjoy this. I'm going fishing." And she went down the mountain and went fishing. And she came back up and she built a fire out of grapevines and grilled this fish. And for dessert, there was yogurt from her own sheep. And I thought, it was the first time I really understood the idea of terroir in food. And I thought, I can go back to New York and I can make grilled fish with herbs and olive oil, but it won't taste like this. And it changed my idea about cooking completely.
Lovely, thank you.
Oh, well, I am such a fangirl. I'm a retired chef, and you have inspired me from the time my sister would clip New York Times reviews of yours, and every few weeks I'd get a packet, or every few months, depending on. But thank you so much. In the days like 40 to 50 years ago, when it was really hard to be an up-and-coming female chef, you were one of the people who gave me the strength to continue my career in what became a lovely, fulfilling career. When I was 13, I worked on an olive farm in Greece, in the southern Peloponnese.
Were you beating the olives off the trees?
Yeah, so thank you again. You bring me back to, my happy food. So you Alice Waters, Mary Richter, Nancy Silverton, you all saw me through the rough times when men didn't want women in kitchens. And you gave me the courage to continue my passion. What do you think about, now kitchens are very different. Young women who are up and coming now, what are your thoughts, what are your insights on what's happening now?
So Nancy is one of my closest friends, and she, if you ask her about being a woman in the kitchen, she will say, I never had a bad experience. I only worked for men who were encouraging, and I think she's telling the truth, but she's really rare. And I think even today, it is not easy to be a woman chef. And part of it is, women have this moment where suddenly you want to have kids. And being a chef it's incredibly long hours. And so I know so many women who at a certain point, Anne Rosenzweig is one. She was one of the, women we all were writing about. She took over the kitchen at 21. And then she decided she just wanted to be a private chef because she wanted to have a kid and she didn't think she could do both. And I've never understood. I did an onstage thing with Ruth Reichl, who has the River Cafe in London. And the way they run their restaurant is there's no real division between the front of the house and the back of the house. Everybody comes in the morning to do prep. They bring their kids. They have childcare. And then often the waiters will decide that they really want to be in the kitchen. And she thinks about it as not just a business, but as a family. And I think that until more restaurateurs think that way, we're going to have a problem for women chefs.
Yeah, no, you are so right. Thank you so much.
So, speaking of women chefs, my wife Kathleen, who was not able to join me for the trip to this conference, would be very disappointed in me if I didn't express her appreciation for all of your writing. Tender at the Bone is such an important part of her sense of humor that we've made the mass poisoning scene a reading at Thanksgiving each year.
I was very lucky to have my mother. I mean, as a writer, I was lucky to have her. I don't know about as a child.
So anyway, I just wanted you to know that somewhere out there, people are celebrating holidays with readings from the most horrible parts of your book.
Well, I love that. You know, it's like the Art Buchwald Merci Donnant. I love being your Merci Donnant.
Yes. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
My name is Dr. Taylor Ava Fryer, and I'm an art historian. And it's funny, I'm from the Bay Area, but I live here in San Miguel between here and Paris for many years. And I'm so delighted by your work. And while I was listening to some of the passages you were reading here for us tonight, it reminded me so much of the language that we use in art criticism and art critique. And I'm wondering if you see that as part of your work. Are there any parallels between food criticism and art criticism?
Well, I think there's parallels between all criticism, actually. I mean, criticism. I mean, for me, the problem with restaurant criticism is that for so much, not so much in the past, but for so many critics, it's just Consumer Reports. Spend your money on this, don't spend your money on that. And that's not what criticism is. Criticism is giving people the tools to have a better experience, to better appreciate, whether it's a book, a painting, a movie, or a meal. And that's what good criticism is. So I do think that, I mean, when I was in art history, my professors used to complain about my hortatory prose because I hate art speak. You know, I hate the way art forum reads. It just makes me crazy. And so I, at the time, really thought a lot about how do you write about art in a way that makes sense to ordinary people. Right. And I feel the same way about food. So I don't know if that's an answer, but
No, short and simple is best. Thank you.
So I'm sitting there continually struck by the stories of women who had to struggle against sexism in food and in art, and thinking about the world that we live in right now. Do you have any pointers for skillfully and less rage than I'm currently feeling for dismantling the patriarchy so we're not telling these same stories a decade from now?
I'm sorry.
I know I'm really putting you on the spot.
I'm sorry. You know, I after listening to John's talk today, I feel so pessimistic about all of it. How do we change any of it now? I mean, I really don't. I mean, how do you fight back in this moment? It is so hard.
And it's kept so many gifts from us, and it will continue to keep so many gifts from us as a
I mean,
planet.
things are worse now than they have been for most of my lifetime. I mean, the idea that we are a country that is probably, you know, we're not going to allow abortions anywhere. You know,
I didn't mean to be a complete downer. I'm very sorry.
I don't see anything good happening anytime soon.
Okay, we ride at dawn. Thank you.
Hi, Ruth. My name is Frankie, restaurateur, foodie all my life. And in the 80s, I was a huge fan of you when I lived in Los Angeles and looked forward every week to your reviews in the Los Angeles Times, your articles in Gourmet. So it's very exciting to have you in San Miguel here now. I also wrote for a period, freelancing, restaurant reviews for a couple of newspapers in Eastern Washington, inspired by you. And my question is, if you can tell us all of an experience that you had writing about a restaurant in greater Los Angeles, one of many that you did, and what stood out, just the first one that pops in your head, and how that experience was.
Well, this is probably not what you want, but for writers it's probably interesting. When Nancy Silverton and Mark Peel opened Campanile, I loved that restaurant so much, and I tried very hard to write about it myself. And I thought, you know, they were both doing things that nobody else had really done in Los Angeles. I mean, Nancy changed desserts. I mean, she went from making very sweet, sugary desserts to, you know, finding things like Persian mulberries, and I'd never seen them before. I mean, she was really going to local farmers and getting very fruit-forward desserts. And Mark was, they were making their own mozzarella, warm mozzarella, you know, it would come to the table. I'd never seen that before. And they were doing really food that we called urban rustic. And it was I really wanted to write about it. And I tried writing around the fact that they were friends. And I finally realized that there was no way that I could do that, and I had to get somebody else to write the review. You can't write about your friends as a restaurant critic. It just doesn't work.
Hi, Ruth. My name is Susan Gollum, and I'm a literary agent, and I've probably sold more books to Susan Campbell than any other editor. And we had many meals together, as you can imagine, and she would always bring one of your books. And I was just so happy to hear you talk about your relationship with her, and I think about her all the time, and it's lovely to meet you.
You should all know that Susan Campbell was a brilliant editor, and this book was her idea. She did say, I loved that chapter and Save Me the Plums, and why don't you write this book? And she passed away before the book was written. And at her memorial, I think 8 of us spoke. Salman Rushdie, Elizabeth Strout, me, Gary Steingart, Allegra Goodman, and every one of us said she was the best editor we ever worked with. And the thing that was brilliant about Susan was she was one of the few editors I've ever met who didn't want to be a writer. She just wanted to help you make the best book you possibly could. And I miss her so much.
And she edited. I mean, she did draft after. I mean, I do a lot of editing, and then I would give her something, and then she'd do even more editing. And you don't find that anymore. Nobody is putting in that time and effort.
And she very much, I mean, with my first novel, Delicious, it was done. I was at the MacDowell Colony working on the next book, and Susan called me and said, you know, I've been thinking, and you need a prologue. And I was like, Susan, it's done. And she said, no, you know, and she just never stopped trying to think about how do you make your book better. And it is such a gift to a writer. I mean, anybody who thinks that they don't need an editor is wrong.
Well, I remember hearing that Mexican cuisine was designated or has been designated as a World Heritage Site. Is that accurate?
Maybe it is. I just remember, you know, Kiko calling me and saying, you know, I've been really working on this and it's hard. It's very hard to do. And, you know, it's very hard to get the people at UNESCO to really understand how important food is.
Oh,
Well, thank you. Thank you.